POV note: the Crimean-Nogai raids were slave raids by the Khanate of Crimea and the Nogai Horde into the region of Rus, then controlled earlier by the Grand Duchy of Moscow and later Tsardom of Russia and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They began after Crimea became independent about 1441 and lasted until Crimea was brought under Russian control in 1774. The main purpose was the capture of slaves, most of whom were exported to the Ottoman slave markets in Constantinople or elsewhere in the Middle East. The raids were an important drain of the human and economic resources of both countries. They largely prevented the settlement of the wild fields, the steppe and forest steppe land that extends from hundreds of miles south of Moscow to the Black Sea and now contains most of the Russian and Ukrainian population. The raids were also important in the development of the Cossacks. The number of people involved varies, according to Alan W. Fisher. The number of people deported from the Slavic lands on both sides of the border during the 14th to 17th centuries was about 3 million people. Michael Khodorkovsky estimates that 150,000–200,000 people were abducted from Russia in the first 50 years of the 17th century. By way of comparison, the Atlantic slave trade affected about 12 million people, while Arabs captured 10 to 18 million African slaves over a much longer period. Besides the raids, there was also a voluntary slave trade between Russians and Tatars. Russian slavery did not have racial restrictions. Russian girls were legally allowed to be sold in Russian-controlled Novgorod to Tatars from Kazan in the 1600s by Russian law. Germans, Poles, and Lithuanians were allowed to be sold to Crimean Tatars in Moscow. In 1665, Tatars were allowed to buy from the Russians Polish and Lithuanian slaves. Before 1649, Russians could be sold to Muslims under Russian law in Moscow. This contrasted with other places in Europe outside Russia where Muslims were not allowed to own Christians. Causes: economic factors. Most of the raids fell on territory of today's Russia and Ukraine, lands previously divided between Muscovy and Lithuania, although some fell on Moldavia and Circassia. A considerable part of the male population of Crimea took part in these campaigns. The main economic goal of the raids was booty, some of it material, but most of it human. These human trade goods were mostly sold on to the Ottoman Empire, although some remained in Crimea. The main slave market was Kaffa, which after 1475 was part of the coastal strip of Crimea that belonged to the Ottomans. Political factors. The Crimean Khanate broke off from the Golden Horde in 1441. When the horde came to an end in 1502, the buffer between Crimea and its northern neighbors disappeared. The Khans took advantage of the conflicts between Lithuania and Moscow, allying now with one, then with the other, and using the alliance with one as a justification to attack the other. During the Russo-Lithuanian War of 1500 to 1506, the Crimeans were allied with Russia and penetrated deep into Lithuania. Relations soon deteriorated. Near-continuous raids on Muscovy began in 1507. Military. The theatre of war. At the beginning of this period, between the Crimean Khanate and the Duchy of Moscow lay almost 700 miles of thinly populated grassland, the so-called wild fields. The Oka River, 40 miles south of Moscow, was both the principal and last line of defense. It was guarded by the Beregovaya Služba. This continued to exist even after the construction of the Belgorod line far to the south. Its troops rarely crossed the Oka, even when there were massive Tatar attacks on the fortresses to the south. Between Muscovy and Crimea there were three main routes, also known as trails. To avoid fords they generally followed the high ground between one river basin and another. The Murivsky Trail was the western route. It began at the headwaters of the Samara River and tended north-northwest across tributaries Seversky Donets River. It then crossed to the watershed of the Vorskla River to the east of the Belgorod area. In the steppe north of Belgorod, at the sources of the Donets, Pelon-Donets-Simitsa, there is a place called Dumchi Kurgan. Here the trail split. The main branch went northeast and at the headwaters of the Sem River joined the Izyumsky Trail. To the west the Bekev Trail went between the Sem River and the Sil River, and the Pagnutsky Trail went northwest to the upper reaches of the Oka River. The Izyumsky Trail, like the Murivsky Trail, started at the upper reaches to the Samara but went directly north to Izyum Kurgan where the Tatars crossed the Donets. It then passed west of Oskol River and at the headwaters of the Wolf River and the Nezegel River there was a branch to the east which led to the Oskol Basin and the Kalmius Trail, continuing further between the Korocha River and the upper right tributaries of the Oskol. The Izyumsky Trail connected to the Murivsky Trail at the sources of the Sem River. The villages of the Belgorod district were to the west and those of the Oskol district were to the east. North of the junction the trail led north and crossed to the basin of the Bystraya Sosna River. Having crossed this river the Tatars could turn to the Zusha River, a tributary of the Oka, and the Novosel, Mtsensky and Chernsky districts, or cross to the upper reaches of the Mekka River and the villages around Tula. The Kalmius Trail began east of the other two of the upper Kalmius River north of the Cvzdov. The Tatars crossed the Donets River west of Ada and headed the north between the Oskol River and the Ada River passing east of Valuiki. They usually crossed the Tigaya Sosna River at Stone Ford, but there were other crossings. Further north trail forded the Bystraya Sosna River. In addition to these three steppe trails there were others, usually connected to the main three. The Savinsky Trail crossed the Donets above Izyum Kurgan and connected with the Izyumsky Trail. East of the three main trails was the Nogai Trail, which was used by the independent Nogais who lived in the Caspian and Kuban region. It crossed the upper Bityug River between Voronezh and the Tsna River. All to the Tatar invasion routes tended to follow the high and dry lands between river basins to avoid river crossings, swamps and forests. The raiding parties were always accompanied by guides who knew the steppe country, the easiest fords and best camping places. Tactics. According to the 16th century English diplomat Charles Fletcher the Elder, the Tatars would split into several groups, attack one or two places on the border and then direct the main attack to another place that had been left undefended. They fought in small groups. They would sometimes man straw dummies on the spare horses to make themselves appear more numerous. According to the 16th century French mercenary Jacques Margaret, 20,000–30,000 Tatar horsemen would attack the main Russian force while other troops would devastate the Russian lands and return without suffering much damage. They deliberately spread false rumors about the strength and plans. The French engineer Beauplan, who had participated in the war against them, gave a good description of Tatar tactics in the 1630s and 1640s in what is now Ukraine. He said that the Tatars looked oriental and could be easily distinguished from the Russians and Poles. A Tatar horseman was armed with a saber, bow and quiver with 18 to 20 arrows. On his belt was a knife, an awl and a flint for making fires. He also carried 10 or 12 yards of rope to tie up prisoners. They were skilled horsemen and each man usually had 2 spare horses. When crossing a river they loaded the clothing and equipment on a light raft, tied it to a horse and crossed the river swimming, holding on to the horse's mane. Both large and small groups raided in summer. Winter raids were rare, but always involved large numbers of warriors. When they reached a populated area, groups of several hundred split off from the main body. These spread out through the countryside and surrounded villages. So that no one would escape at night, they lit large fires. They then robbed, burned and slaughtered and carried away not only men, women and children, but bulls, cows, goats and sheep. The fate of the captives. On the steppe, the condition of the captives as they were being carried to the Crimea was very difficult. Held in bondage, divided into small groups, hands tied behind the backs with rawhide straps, tied to wooden poles with ropes around the necks, held at the end of a rope, surrounded by and tied to horsemen. They were driven by whips across the steppe without stopping. The weak and infirm often had the throats cut so they would not delay the march. They were often fed the meat of worn-out horses. Reaching the lower Dnieper, where they were relatively safe from Cossacks, the Tatars let the horses graze freely while they set about dividing the captives, each of whom had been marked with a hot iron. Having received their slaves as inalienable property, each Tatar could do with them as he wished. According to Sigismund von Herberstein, the old and infirm, who were not worth much money, were given to the Tatar youths like rabbits to hunting dogs for the first military practice, and were either stoned to death, or thrown into the sea or killed in some other way. Here are the words of Duke Antoine de Gramont, who was with the Polish Tatar army during the campaign of King John Casimir on the left bank Ukraine, in 1663 to 1664, when, according to him, about 20,000 were captured. The Tatars slit the throats of all men over 60 years old who were thought to be incapable of work. 40-year-olds were saved for the galleys, young boys for their pleasure, and girls and women to continue the kind and then later to be sold. The prisoners were divided equally and lots were cast according to age, so that no one could complain that he had got in more old ones than young. To their credit I must say that they were not stingy with the booty, and with extreme politeness offered it to all who came the way. In Crimea and Turkey, in Crimea they were driven to the slave market and placed in single file, bound together by the neck. The buyers carefully inspected the slaves, starting with their exterior appearance and ending with intimate parts of the bodies, to be sure that there were no missing or blackened teeth, warts, bumps, or other imperfections. Beautiful girls were especially valued. The main slave market was at Kaffa, which after 1475 belonged to the Ottoman Empire. The town had artillery and a strong garrison of janissaries. Besides Kaffa, slaves were sold in Karasi Bazaar, Tozleri, Bakhchisarai and Kazov. Slave dealers came from various backgrounds: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians and others. For the right to trade they paid tax to the Crimean Khan and Turkish Pasha. In Kaffa there were sometimes as many as 30,000 slaves, mostly from Muscovy and the southeastern lands of the Commonwealth. Ruthenian slaves were slightly more valuable than those from Muscovy, since the latter were considered treacherous and likely to run away. Michaelon Litvin described Kaffa as an insatiable and lawless abyss, drinking our blood. Besides the bad food, water, clothing and shelter, they were subjected to exhausting labor and abuse. According to Litvin, the strongest slaves were castrated, others had their noses and ears slit and were branded on the forehead or cheek. By day they were tormented with forced labor and at night kept in dungeons. Once sold they were transported to distant provinces, Greece, Syria, and Anatolia. On the way they had to endure torment. Often the ship was so overcrowded that they could neither move nor lie down on the deck. They ate and slept standing up. Under such conditions large numbers grew sick and died, the latter being thrown into the sea. Men were often sent to the Turkish galleys where they were worked to exhaustion, chained to the benches. One galley slave who managed to escape was Ivan Bolotnikov, who later led a Cossack uprising. According to the Greeks, during the Ottoman epoch 3 or 4 ships arrived at Constantinople every day loaded with Russian slaves. A significant number were sent to Anatolia for agricultural work. Female captives were sent to rich homes for carnal pleasure and harems, while the less beautiful were assigned domestic work. The Venetian monk Giovanni Carrara read that in Constantinople there was little demand for hired servants since the place was full of Ruthenian and Russian slaves. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Sultan's wife Roxelana. Michael Litvin wrote, "All of them, that is the Eastern peoples, eagerly seek wives among the Slavonic captives." The current Sultan's favorite wife and the mother of his son and heir was abducted from our land. The Perekop Khan, Sahib Jarrah, was born a Christian and is married to a Christian. The ministers of these tyrants, the eunuchs, secretaries and other officials, and the special troops, who are called Janissaries, all have come from our blood. Despite the large number of slaves sent to Asia Minor, there was no shortage of them in Crimea. Many slaves were used for domestic work, the digging of wells, the production of salt and the gathering of dung on the steppe. The women were concubines and also performed household chores, yarn making and the care of children and domestic animals. Resistance to the raids. Russia. In addition to simple self-defense, the Russians slowly pushed a line of forts and walls southward, behind which grew an increasing peasant population, until, after 250 years, the Crimea was overwhelmed. Poland. Lithuania. In the early 1550s, Dmytro Vishnevetsky, a Ruthenian noble and Cossack hetman, began building forts at the mouth of the Dnieper, to close the trail from Crimea to Ukraine and Poland. On the island of Khortytsia near Konskaya Boda and the Crimean nomads, a fortress was built, which gave rise to the Zaporozhian Sich, composed of Cossacks living on the lower Dnieper beyond the rapids. Polish King Sigismund II Augustus assigned Vishnevetsky the duty of protecting the Polish and Ukrainian borderlands from Crimean Tatar raids. Polish resistance might have become significant, but it was vitiated by the Khmelnytsky uprising and the ruin. In folk culture, the numerous raids and abduction of captives left a deep imprint on popular culture. In Ukrainian ballads and tales, one of the main themes is Turkish slavery, the release from bondage and safe return to the homeland. Historians on the Tatar raids. Vasily Klyachevsky. During the 16th century, year after year, thousands of people on the borderland vanished from the fatherland, and tens of thousands of the best people in the country set off for the southern border to protect the inhabitants of the central provinces from captivity and ruin. If you consider how much time and spiritual and material strength was wasted in the monotonous, brutal, toilsome and painful pursuit of these wily steppe predators, one need not ask what people in Eastern Europe were doing while those of Western Europe advanced in industry and commerce, in civil life and in the arts and sciences.